From the Lean Enterprise Institute in Boston, this is the WLEI Podcast, where we share stories of people making the world better through lean thinking and practice. For more information about LEI, please visit lean.org.
Today, Josh Howell and I are joined by Rivian CEO RJ Scaringe and COO Jim Morgan. Rivian is an electric vehicle company that stormed into the auto industry in 2019 with announcements of an all-electric pickup and an SUV slated for production in the second half of 2020. One round of its $3 billion in funding was notably led by Amazon, which subsequently ordered 100,000 electric delivery vans. Josh and I were lucky to spend the day at Rivian's design studio, where we learned how RJ is not just designing products that could disrupt the auto industry in the new decade, but designing an organization to last for many decades to come. Let's get started.
I guess maybe to start, maybe you could just describe for us, what is it about this moment in time in the history of Rivian that is makes it such an interesting time for the company?
Yeah, well, it's interesting starting a business like this because there's a number of items you need to have at the same time or in parallel, that all of which are hard. So to launch a car company, you need billions of dollars, you need 1,000 plus engineers, you need 250 suppliers providing all the content for the vehicle. You need a manufacturing plant and a manufacturing team to run that plant. Technology has to be proven and tested in multiple winters and summers, and then that technology has to be wrapped in a vehicle that ultimately generate demand that customers will want. So if it's a unique market proposition. And the challenge is the order of operations of how to build all those things when you start from zero. So when I started the company 10 years ago, I had none of those. No team, no money, no technology, no plants, no suppliers, no facilities.
And yet you wanted to build a car company.
Yeah, and the challenge is figuring out how do you go about building all those things that you need. Even if you had all those things at the very start, it will still take you 4 years. And perhaps the biggest challenge is the capital needs. So you need billions of dollars, but to get those billions of dollars, you need to convince people to give you those or invest those billions of dollars. But you need to do that at the beginning without any of the things necessary to prove you can do it. So to make a very long story short, over the course of the last 10 years, we intentionally built different parts of the business and iteratively refined the strategy, had a major pivot off of the initial product plan in 2011 to essentially what you see today. And really over the last 8 years since 2011, we've been putting those pieces together. And in some cases, the order of operations was not necessarily what we would have liked, but it was required by how we were able to build each of those areas. So suppliers, team, capital, manufacturing.
So what's an example of that, the order of operations as it played out in your case?
Well, to do anything, you need to have some capital. So really starting with finding the right people to back the business and then developing and building confidence with them. And it's not as if 8 years ago somebody walked in and said, well, here's $500 million, get going. You start with much smaller investment levels and you essentially de-risk different areas of the business. And the areas we focused on de-risking in the early days in order largely to generate stronger support from investors were within the product and technology space. So demonstrating both that we could execute the product, but also that the product was technically feasible. And then secondly, validating and demonstrating that there's a market for what we're building. And today, it's easier to see there's a market for what we're building, but 8-9 years ago, the idea of an electric pickup truck took some more convincing. So, make a long story short, what we're seeing now is actually the culmination of all those sort of parallel build-outs all now being at essentially full steam and starting to come together. So we're very well capitalized. We have a manufacturing plant and a manufacturing team. We have hundreds of suppliers that are deeply engaged with us. We have a team of about 1,600 people developing the products. And then on top of all that, we've wrapped them in a market and brand position that has fortunately really connected quite well with consumers. And part of the strategy was we've underpinned all of that with a really intentional technology strategy where the technology used within our vehicles not only supported our own brand and our own lineup of cars, but very importantly, supports a multitude of different B2B businesses. The biggest...
So this is the skateboard.
Yeah, it's basically taking our skateboard, which the physical version of that is the batteries, the drivetrain, the cooling systems, the chassis. But the digital version is equally important. So all the network architecture, the ECUs, the software, when I say software, the full stack of software on all of those main big domain controllers, which we're building in-house. And essentially that providing a platform for which we can create very different products for very different markets. And what we've now announced with Amazon is a perfect embodiment of that, where we can really rethink in its entirety the logistics space using this platform, and be able to go very quickly because we're able to reuse a lot of the more challenging long lead time technologies. So anyways, so we're seeing this is sort of the orchestra starting to play. So all the instruments are now there. We're beginning to see the music of what took a lot of time to get all the right pieces there, and which I would say 10 years ago when I was first starting, it was not at all clear on how you go about arranging all the instruments for that orchestra to play music.
Yeah.
But it was like anything else. The only way to start was to start. So lots of U-turns, lots of twists, lots of turns, lots of gut punches. But sort of overall, just brute force built it.
So one of the, in preparation for today, I just went through and read the series of news releases on your website just from the last 12 months, and each one of them has the blurb about Rivian, and then about Ford or about Amazon.
Yep.
And in each of the about Rivian paragraphs, there's a number given of how many people work at Rivian.
They keep growing.
And from 1 month to the next, I mean, that number can be hundreds different.
Yeah.
You mentioned even before we started that just this week, 55 people started with the company. I mean, that's an incredible rate of growth to have dozens of people joining the company each and every week. What
in
is
fact, I say 1,600. I might be wrong. Growing rapidly. So by the end of the year, it'll be significantly more, and certainly by the end of next year, it'll be a lot more.
For sure. So how is it? As the leader over this organization, an organization that not so long ago was, a dozen people, 200 people maybe a year ago, whatever, to what it is now. What is it that's different about sort of the challenge that you have as the leader of this organization from what it would have been 2 years ago, even, or 12 months ago?
It's interesting. So one of the big challenges is that, 10 years ago is one person, 5 years ago is probably 100 people, and 2 years ago, I don't know, 300-400 people. So like the processes and the systems that we set up when it was 10 people don't work when it's 50, and certainly don't work when it's 100. And then the processes we redesigned when it was 100 cease to work when we're 200, and that just continues to play out. And a lot of the way things are designed and built when you're operating at a relatively small scale, you can rely on the benefits of just simply being small, and the benefits of not having to manage a lot of complexity or a lot of people within the system. And as we're scaling now, it's designing intentionally processes that are as lightweight as possible, but that streamline everything from how decisions are made to how capital is deployed, to how we coordinate between different functions. We're geographically across a few locations as well, so how do we coordinate across locations? But that's a constant state of process design while you're flying the plane. So it'd be nice if you could sort of pause everything that the business has to do and say, hey, for the next month, let's work on all of our processes. But we're also flying the plane, so it's not, pragmatically you can't do that.
Sure.
We have really aggressive timelines for launching a whole host of different products. So it's part of it is learning to run and simultaneously swim and simultaneously design the way we're running and swimming. So it's complex.
Yeah, in your book, Jim, you describe the difference between, or you describe something called enabling bureaucracy versus coercive bureaucracy, or sort of just a free-floating enterprise. And what you just described, RJ, sounded like you're trying to build that enabling bureaucracy. Bureaucracy is kind of a terrible word, but a way to govern a lot of people as lightly as possible towards a common mission. So, how are you two working together to build? I mean, you've described it as the Rivian way, or how are you working to build that?
Yeah, I think RJ described
Working hard.
Yeah, he described it really well. It's sort of just enough. Sort of infrastructure to help us operate effectively. As RJ mentioned, we have multiple locations, we have a lot of different functions. We also have people that come from a host of different companies, and they all have different backgrounds, different language, different acronyms, different cultures or styles of working. And so we have the opportunity to learn from all of them, right? And sort of use that knowledge to create a unique to Rivian way of working. Easier said than done, because as RJ pointed out, we're also developing products, right? We're on critical path, and so the easy thing to do is default to what you're used to doing, right? What you brought with you from whatever company you came from, and that also leads to people sort of working in cliques, right? People who speak the same language, quote unquote, or use the same acronyms, or are used to doing things a certain way. And so what we're trying to do is be very intentional about developing the Rivian way, whether it's the way we develop products, the way we run our manufacturing operations, the way we work with our suppliers. We want to pick all the best characteristics of what people bring to Rivian, but combine them in a new way, in a more effective way. And believe me, the temptation is to sort of default to sort of the easy way of how we used to do this. But I don't think in the long run Rivian will be nearly as successful as if we're able to do this I describe it as being very intentional about the way we create these processes, the way we build this operating infrastructure. And to enroll everybody in that process is really crucial, right? So that they develop some emotional and intellectual investment in the way things are done. And so that creates this ownership that can then be sustained over time at Rivian, as opposed to sort of imposing these things on people. So while it takes more time and can at times be a bit frustrating, in the long run, we'll end up with a much more powerful culture.
So it's interesting, the notion of wanting to create the Rivian way, not try to copy some way of working from any of these other companies that are kind of where people are coming from. And there's the perspective of, I guess, someone like yourself, Jim, who had a background at Ford and is now within the last year joining up this company and contributing to the development of the Rivian way. There's also employee number one from 10 years ago, or some of those 100 people from 5 years ago who have been developing the Rivian way since its genesis, that are now experiencing the infusion of the Ford way in your case, or the Apple way in the case of some other folks. So how is, I guess maybe just speak to your own experience of encountering these different ways of working that people are bringing into this company. I guess if you could share a little bit about that.
Jim said this, it's an important point. We're building a team of exceptional people, and we're intentionally bringing people in from a multitude of different places. So whether it's Apple or Tesla or Toyota or Ford, they're coming in with different backgrounds, and that's actually good. That's what we're going for. But
it's by design, not just by necessity.
But simultaneously, we have to recognize that as folks come in, we have to unlearn some behaviors or experiences and relearn and create the way we work. And that's sometimes harder said than done, or I should say easier said than done, because there's just a lot of emotional energy that you may have invested in the past into a certain way of behaving that needs to be adjusted. And it's not a one-time occurrence. It's an ongoing process of refining and maturing the way we work together. The other thing that's happening with the rate at which we're scaling is processes, as I said, are changing and have to adapt to the size of the organization. And Jim and I are spending a lot of time making sure we're differentiating between tactical solutions that are appropriate for that moment in time versus philosophies or organizational behaviors that are permanent. And
I've heard the term first principles as a way to
so it's another way to look at it. So when we're 100 people 5-6 years ago, the tactics we use there are very different than the tactics we're using today. But the philosophies, treat people the right way, respect one another, transparency, these philosophies have to remain. And those started, as you said, with employee number one, with myself. And sometimes if the tactics get confused as philosophies, that can be problematic. So we're very cognizant of making sure we're crisp on the things that are sacred, that can't change, but very flexible and intentionally very fluid on the things that need to change. And this is where it's been a huge, hugely beneficial to have Jim here, helping to design and build, what are the processes, and then through that to bolster and improve and deepen some of the philosophies that tie to those processes.
You mentioned, I just want to add to that, you mentioned the first principles piece. Those first principles are sort of RJ's basic philosophy around who Rivian is and why Rivian exists, is the main reason that I'm here trying to help. So it as you know, it took a lot to get me out of Traverse City, and it's only because of the aspirations that we have here in Rivian to care just as much about the how as the what, to really be intentional about the why. Those first principles are why I'm here, and the opportunity to be part of manifesting those into an operating system, into so the way we work, the Rivian way we talk about increasingly, is just it's a privilege.
No, go ahead.
Yeah, as we were walking around, it certainly struck me that everybody spoke similar to that, Jim. People are here for not just a salary, but because they feel a great sense of aspirational purpose. I've felt that in just the few hours that I've been here. But I think a big turning point in the company is taking place at Normal, where you are preparing to manufacture your vehicles. And if there is a brown spot in the company, I guess it could be at Normal, because it's previously a Mitsubishi plant. And there's something of an existing workforce that I understand will be returning to the plant. What's been, or how are you thinking about how to take the culture that exists in this office, the offices in Irvine, Palo Alto, and instill them in the plant at Normal?
Yeah, I'll take a shot at this. So I think one of the things that is really exciting about Rivian is that, as we were walking around, I explained that we're not differentiating between sort of roles in the company, types of employees, whether it's software, whether it's the battery labs, or whether it's here, the Plymouth Development Center, or at the plant. The facility looks very similar. We put just as much care into the offices at the plant as we do any place else. We work hard to have the same operating rules in each of the facilities. We really strive to make it almost invisible, sort of where you are once you get inside the facility, if that makes sense. And the way that we engage with the rest of the team is the same, irrespective of what location we're at or what your particular job function is. Whether that's RJ talking to everybody. I mean, people at Rivian all sort of value their personal relationship with RJ, and I've seen a lot where he interacts with people identically regardless of where they're at. So In terms of the manufacturing facility itself, the same feel, the same culture, the same look is there as is in each of the facilities.
Yeah, and I think it gets back to making sure we maintain that consistent philosophy of how we treat people and how we those behavioral philosophies. So of course, the tactics are going to be different. So some of the details of how we run the plant and how the workforce interacts with the course of their day versus how somebody in, let's say, the marketing team might their day may look are going to be very different. But we come from the same belief system, and you ask the question of what's the process look like at the plant where we're bringing a workforce in that had in large part previously worked in this facility with different philosophies and different operating processes. I actually look at that as a huge strength, and a lot of it is, for us, we're lucky. This is a facility that was commissioned in the late 80s. First model year was 1990, so it's a relatively new facility, particularly in the world of brownfield automotive plants. It's one of the newest in the world that we could have acquired. And the workforce that's there, many of them, their first job out of college or out of high school was in this plant. And imagine coming into this facility in its beginning days and helping to either build it, launch it, or run it in those early years, and then being part of the process of being in that facility for 20, 25 years, and then having to shut it down. And when you're mid-career, and now the opportunity to relaunch that facility, and the energy and the excitement that comes from being part of that relaunch and what that means for the community, it's not something that you could actually buy, that kind of commitment. And you see it in the workforce, you see it in the teams. There's one of the things, frankly, I'm most excited about with the facility is actually the team that we're building there. It's of course, the facility is going to be amazing, but ultimately it's about the people and the operating philosophies and the operating behaviors we set up there. And to have as a backdrop the energy and the passion that people aren't paying attention to whether they're 5 minutes early, 5 minutes late, but rather how do I get my job done the best of possible ways. It's again, you can't buy that.
So it strikes me that there's an interesting kind of give and take happening in various ways throughout Rivian between like kind of old, existing, and new, and these things kind of feeding each other. So we just described in one way the sort of flow of the Rivian philosophy, the Rivian culture, the Rivian way, which is new. I mean, this is a relatively new company, and how that's being introduced to an existing and older place, right? The factory Normal, those workers who have had a previous experience. When we were walking around the office here, it was explained to us one of the platforms where people can sit, and there's sort of stairwell that goes up. That was transplanted
from the plant,
from Normal as a catwalk there that now is a place. So there's a sort of a concrete example,
that was intentional,
of the old
metaphor,
place, the sort of existing introducing here. So what would be maybe another example of these previous experiences, whether it's something from Ford or something from Normal, maybe Normal is a good place to kind of focus on, where Rivian is stronger today, is benefiting from a learning that is sort of pulled out of Normal, not just a catwalk that's now a nice.
It's the whole company. To be honest, the whole company is our strength is the team, and the team is a wonderful mix of people coming right out of college to people that have been working in the auto industry for 30 years, to people that have been in the technology space, since the early Apple days. So it's by design a mix of these experiences, and the mosaic of experiences that comes out of that is what forms the picture that is the Rivian team. Now, because it is a mosaic, we need to make sure we're organized, and we need to make sure we're thoughtful about how we combine all those pieces, and we need to be thoughtful about how we train and sort of establish how we work together. But absolutely, the reason our success is going to be built on the aggregate set of experiences. I mean, you're sitting right here with Jim, so Jim's is case in point. He's got arguably more experience than anyone in the world when it comes to designing product development systems and processes, and designing operating processes. So to have his experience in as part of this, it's amazing. But Jim, just like us all, he's learning every day.
Absolutely.
And it's through the learnings and through the openness to see the world differently that we take what Jim came in with and we continue to improve it. I don't know, Jim, do you want to comment on that?
I completely agree. I think that I've learned a tremendous amount here, but I think we all continue to learn from each other because of the sort of back to first principles, sort of the humility that's necessary to learn. The sort of, I don't know everything, right? I can learn from other people, that we can learn from people who came from other companies with different experiences, whether it's the former Apple guys or the former Tesla people or the former McLaren folks that make up this mosaic. The thing that's awesome about Rivian is the focus on being inclusive, the focus on valuing that previous experience, valuing what you bring to the team, right, and integrating that into the mosaic that RJ described, and then creating an infrastructure that enables, you talked about enabling bureaucracy, I think about enabling infrastructures that can bring the best of those people, right, together to create who Rivian is and the products that we create, ultimately for our customers, benefit from our ability to bring that all together into a powerful force. Yeah,
I think it's really remarkable, Jim. I mean, to sort of give you just a bit of kudos. In the world of LEI, lean product and process development has been something that has been a really kind of focus of the Institute for the last handful of years, with you as its leader. And there are a lot of people in our community who look to you as the thought leader in this space in terms of lean thinking applied to product and process development. And I'm sure that you just referenced that it was that wealth of experience that Jim has that was attractive to bring him into Rivian to help in the ways that you're now helping. But then at the same time, to hear you articulate really like a learner's mindset and the openness that this challenge is requiring from you as someone who many of us look to, RJ included, as being really an expert with a wealth of experience and capability that we can all learn from. To hear you at the same time celebrate the learning that you're getting from this experience and what you can learn from, we were talking earlier, what you can learn from the 20-year-olds who are here in this company, the 30-year-olds, is I just think that's a real testament to you and what I've really come to appreciate of the leaders that I most admire, folks like Jim Womack and John Shook, who we all know, that really have never lost that kind of learner's mindset in a world that frankly is chock full of a lot of folks that don't have that at all, that are quite confident that they just kind of have the answer to most things. It's really cool that while you're looking to him to come in and really be this expert, that maybe even more valuable to you and the company is the fact that Jim's coming in with that experience for sure, but coming in as an avid, committed, eager learner himself. And if he wouldn't, it sounds like the Rivian way wouldn't have accepted Jim.
It's also part of our culture is to constantly be learning and be open to learn, and constantly be checking your assumptions. I think it's really important not only for us as a company, but in this industry with the rate at which things are changing, to be open to constantly learning and constantly reevaluating your assumptions.
So that has to flow from you. I mean, one of the things that we've been curious about coming in is, given the extensiveness of the growth and the change that this company has experienced in just the last 10 years, for you personally, what are some of the kind of leadership lessons that you've accumulated over the years? And the fact that you're this open learner and cherishing somebody like Jim who's similar, you're amenable to that. So I don't know. It'd be interesting for us to hear just a little bit about maybe some of the key learnings for you that you've accumulated in the last 10 years.
Yeah, it's not a day that goes by that something new doesn't emerge and something to learn from. I think Jim probably taught me 3 things yesterday, and 2 of them were after 9 o'clock at night. So, jokes aside, it absolutely it's. Building and scaling a business like this is incredibly humbling because there's simply so much that you don't know, and because of the nature of how the company's been built, there are so many mistakes that are necessary as part of the growth process. And key for us, the reason we're sitting here today is the ability to recognize where things aren't right and the ability to adjust. So if the way that I originally envisioned the business, or the way that I originally sort of sold the business as we're looking for partners, investors, was the same today as it was 9-10 years ago, we wouldn't be sitting here. So I say to my wife all the time, one of the most important things I think for me is to remain idealistic, which means to remain curious. It's actually one of our core behaviors of the business is to stay curious. And implicit with staying curious is also, learning is continuing to observe all those things that you can do better yourself. So for me, I'd say one of the biggest learnings, and ironically, it's if you'd asked me a long time ago what I thought was the most important thing for the business, I would have said it's about people, making sure you understand the strength that Jim has said to me a few times. The strength of the pack is the wolf, and the strength of the wolf is the pack. But really understanding that it's the strength of the team and the way that the team works together, and the combination of skill sets necessary for a team to be successful. I would have spoke to that 9 years ago, but it's not a day goes by where I don't realize that even more so. So if I could go back and give myself advice, I would have sort of repeated that and said, hey, really, it's about the team. And it's so easy to say. You ask 10 founders what they think, what's the most important thing, they'd likely say it's the team. But really believing that, and then really deriving action from that in how you recruit, how you promote, how you provide feedback. When you have to make hard decisions, meaning when you have the wrong types of people in positions within the company, removing those people, how you go about removing those people. These are all things, each one of those embodies many, many learnings for myself. And of course, with that, many mistakes, I'm sure that, in hindsight, I would have approached differently. But it's the acknowledgement of how to do those things differently that then informs the future actions.
Just to kind of get a little bit more specific, Jim, you've been at Rivian for how long now?
5 months, 6 months, something like that. And
full time, sort of.
Yeah.
He's been involved for a while, but
for a while. But 5 or 6 months, you've been coming here,
right,
supporting the company. First as interim CEO, now as COO. But
I was never a CEO.
Oh, sorry. Did I say CEO?
Yeah.
I meant to say COO.
Some days.
Sorry. COO. And I'm just very curious. We're talking about learning. RJ, you mentioned you've learned a few things from Jim last night, late. But what are some specific things, takeaways you've received from Jim that have changed how you behave? And vice versa. I'll ask Jim kind of the same question, but maybe starting with RJ.
I actually, what I said there is really the broadest, the categorization of how to build teams. And in building a company, there's always gaps. There's lots of gaps. So I think on day one of the first year, year one, I was everything. I was everything from the janitor to the head of CAD to the head of design to the head of HR. So because of that, the ways in which we executed certain things weren't going to be as robust as we would like. Today, a lot of those gaps are filled, but gaps still exist. So within that, the roles for all the individuals within the company are also evolving. And a big part of designing the company for growth is identifying where our strengths and our weaknesses are, and when we identify strengths, making sure we apply them in the right place. When we identify weaknesses, making sure we respond in the right way. there's many ways to respond to a weakness, and oftentimes it's looking in the mirror and saying, how can I? Jim talked about it before. How can we set up the scaffolding better? How can we set up the organization to enable this weakness to become a strength? And I think we're doing that, beautifully right now. I mean, it's always something I wish we could go faster on, but we're identifying ways to get the absolute most out of our people and play to our team's strengths. And then where we see weaknesses, understanding the root issue of what is, if something's not working well. Very often it's easy to point at a person or an individual or something technical, but often it's more nuanced than that. So you guys are familiar. What are the 5 whys? Like, really, let's understand what's really not working here. And that's something Jim has coached me on a lot, which is making sure we ask the second, third, fourth, fifth why, if you will, to make sure we don't immediately think a problem is what our initial sort of exposure or visibility to that problem might be.
Yeah, I think for me, I mean, there's so many things. First of all, technically, I've learned a ton from RJ in terms of, the propulsion system that we have. All this stuff has been very unique to me. Our battery systems. It has been an incredible education from a guy who comes from the internal combustion world, and I've just learned a ton. But I think the thing that stands out for me most in terms of what I've learned from RJ is his ability to think 6 steps ahead. I think that's what helps make him such a successful entrepreneur. It's what helps him, be an effective leader. And I find myself always sort of playing catch up with RJ, sort of like he's already there, right? And sort of what goes beyond that. And so expanding, sort of the way I think strategically to think multiple steps ahead. We talked earlier about the Second Life work that RJ has been doing with Alex Home Foundation. But I mean, we could go on and on in terms of thinking through our distribution, service, whatever models as we think through the business. I think that's where I've learned a ton from RJ.
Well, I'm excited to see what things we've yet learned about that you're already game planning.
Yeah.
Have in mind for the product and the services and everything that they're going to come out.
Yeah.
So one thing that Jim, you were sharing as we were walking around today that you've introduced into the way of working here that's now starting to shape the Rivian way is the idea of visualizing the work sort of in these Obeya spaces and cadenced meetings. You described a few that are now set up. And that's obviously a big part of the way of working with lean thinking. I'd be curious to hear, from you specifically, what's been your experience with some of these tactics, I guess, or techniques that Jim's introduced to the management team, the executive team in particular, and what you perceive as beneficial with working in these new ways.
Yeah. Well, I think at the core, the reason for the cadence of meetings or the Obeya rooms and visual management we put in place, the objective is essentially to make issues clear. You can't manage a secret, as Jim likes to say. And that's been really effective, and it's been really timely as well as we've scaled, where the processes one would use at a small group just don't scale when you're at this size, so as I said before. So this has been great, and I think a lot of the visual tools we're putting in place in the Obeya rooms we've set up. What I find most exciting about them is that they've become self-perpetuating in the sense that the teams truly derive great value from them. So what we've set up at the plant, for example, versus 6 months ago we had a light visual management system in place, to what's now been put in place, which is really sort of the beginnings of what is an incredible Obeya management room, if you will. That was driven, Jim started that chain reaction, but that chain reaction has now been embraced by the plant management team, which is exactly what you want. And that to me is we had a picture Jim sent out yesterday of the team at an Obeya meeting, and you see the level of engagement, you see the level of value that's being created because of it. You see that we're identifying disconnects, we're identifying problems before they exist because of visual management, because of the tools we're putting in place. So it's incredible.
And back to that sort of learning theme that we talked about earlier, as we have been talking about this, as we have been engaging the team in some of these tools and methods, we've been very open about the fact that it's not going to be right the first time, right? In fact, it's probably going to suck the first time through. But the idea is we're putting them in place to PDCA, right? To continually reflect on what we're doing and how can we make it better, how can we be, and that not only helps to improve that infrastructure, but it's also part of enrolling people in the process, right? Making them part of creating this. And so what was great about the reason I sent the picture out to RJ was it had nothing to do with me, right? It was Kip, the plant manager, and all the area managers were engaged, and I wasn't even there, right? I mean, it was them owning it and making it into something that works for them. And I think that's the most important part of any of this.
Yeah, it's a chain reaction. So Jim started and has really been the mentor to across the whole organization on that, but to see the teams now start to embrace it, and then the effect that has on other teams when they see the benefits coming out of these types of approaches and tools is great. And
they've improved on anything I envisioned, right? So they're in a place now that if I was just sort of directing this, we probably never would have gotten to. And so by engaging across the leadership team there, it's much better product or system than it would have been otherwise, right? Because they've all made it better.
Yeah, I hope to go. We talked earlier. Maybe there's an opportunity to go see that at some point. I'd love to go to Normal and check it out, and maybe even watch one of these meetings unfold in that space. I mean, conversely, I guess you also walked us into a room here in Plymouth that was, as you described, kind of a failure in an attempt to set up an Obeya and build a meeting within that context. So, anyway, interesting that
I would characterize it as a temporary failure.
That's right.
Because again, we don't hesitate to push the reset button if something isn't working. We're not wedded to it, right? It's sort of the difference between set-based and iterative design, right? We tried an experiment, didn't work. So what you saw in there is we're reconstructing now based on what we learned through the first experiment. So again, that goes back to humility. Some of us have been doing this a long time. We still get stuff wrong. And so we're okay to push the reset button and not continue to labor with something that's going to get us no place.
Well, what I thought was cool about it was you described that there was a team that now is kind of taking away the learning from that experience to kind of rethink the way to do it.
And I think if you come back out in whatever couple months,
yes, please,
you'll see something else there that the team takes ownership of.
It's very cool.
Right.
Yeah, one thing. So I'm kind of sensing two themes. One is just aspiration. So there's a sense of purpose that exists here at this company, driven by the goals you have as an organization to make, I think, the world a better place through, in this case, making electric vehicles more available and out on the road. But then there's also what we've been talking mostly about is aspiration, inspiration may not be enough. You need to organize people in a manner so you can channel that energy, that inspiration effectively. But I would like to kind of explore the aspirational part of the company with you, RJ. I mean, what sort of context, what kind of vision are you trying to create? And it appears you certainly have created it. You can feel a sense of dedication to the people in the company. But what environment are you trying to create, and what vision are you trying to set for people at Rivian?
Well, as you look at what's happening within transportation, we're going through, you talk about an inflection point for the company, we're also going through an inflection point as a society and how we think about moving people and goods. And it's a necessary inflection point. If you zoom way out, the way we move around on the planet today, and for that matter, the way we power our lives, is almost entirely based upon fossil fuels. And it's an interesting challenge of timescales where the fossil fuels that exist on our planet today were built up over the course of approximately 300 million years, and we're consuming at such a rate that we've used about half of that in about 100 years. So it's not a debate whether or not we have to switch off a dependence on fossil fuels. It's just a requirement, provided we want to continue living the way that we live or something similar to the way we live today. What's interesting is if we're consuming at like 1/3 millionth of the rate that we consume today as a planet, you could just continue to allow for fossil fuels to replenish themselves and live off of fossil fuels. But given the size of the human population on the planet, it's simply not possible. The other wrinkle that makes this quite interesting is the impacts of burning fossil fuels. So while we know with certainty we have to move off of them within a couple of generations following us, it's a certainty. We also know that the longer we wait to make that transition, the greater damage we do to the climate, to the planet, to air quality. And essentially we're moving carbon that was buried into the earth, and we're moving into the atmosphere, which has an impact on temperature, has an impact on climate patterns. We're also changing the makeup of air quality, particularly in dense cities, putting things that are toxic and pollutant in the air. So we see a huge urgency to solve that. And solving that is not a simple problem. And it requires many companies like ourselves to participate in this cross full planet solution. So for us, we see, and I think this intrinsically motivates the team really nicely, we see what we're doing as a key part of that. In the personal vehicle space, we're creating products that help generate excitement and awareness around electrification. We're seeing other companies respond to some of the things that we've built, which we love. That's a really good thing. It's awesome to have more variety of interesting and desirable electric vehicles. It's also important to have consumers want those electric vehicles. And then we're doing the same with the leveraging of our platform. So what we're doing with Amazon is going to set the bar for what other logistics and fleet operated players have to do. So just that strategy and its role within, from a humanity point of view and from a social point of view, creates a level of motivation that can't be fabricated. We're building something that is meaningful, that matters for our kids, and it also is a natural filter for the types of people that we recruit into the organization. And in that alignment around doing good for the world and working our hardest to make sure we leave things better than how we got them informs so many different things. So an example, one that Jim and I were talking about late last night, is on our logistics team. We're looking at the dunnage we're using within our facility, and there's many ways to do it. You can use cardboard, you can have reusable dunnage. What we're working towards as our long-term philosophy is to have, of course, reusable dunnage, but to make that from recycled ocean plastic. And is that going to get all the plastic out of the ocean? No. But is it going to start that process and make a very clear statement? Is it going to create a downstream supply or downstream demand for millions of tons of plastic? Yes. So these are the kinds of things that customers may not ever see. Actually, very few customers will ever see our dunnage, but that are so ingrained and deep within the company's philosophy that just drives these types of decisions, and then it's self-perpetuating. So people see that kind of behavior and say, what can I do to be more efficient in terms of my work or in terms of the product or in terms of the way we make the products?
Yeah, and that particular idea, the people that sort of are doing this work around the ocean-bound plastics, nobody told them to go do that, right? I mean, they got excited about this concept. They got, they did the work around how do we make this happen and how do we bring this to RJ and Jim and talk about how we incorporate that in the way we do our work. Nobody had to tell them to do that. That's their enthusiasm. And RJ mentioned a couple of times, we talked about this or that. It was after 9 o'clock. When we left here, we weren't the only ones in the building, right? I mean, so that sort of internal drive and enthusiasm about being part of Rivian and being part of what this organization stands for is palpable. You guys felt it coming in here, and I see it every day.
I heard a phrase, and I may not get this quote correct, so you guys can correct it, but the idea of this being a company that is creating adventure vehicles for the outdoors that cares for the outdoors, as such a sort of obviously good thing to do, and yet I don't know, maybe here's a pioneering company in demonstrating how to do that. But even that idea that you're explaining, aligns with that sort of mission statement in a pretty clear way. It strikes me that there's a corollary, almost, statement that describes also the company you're building as a company that is for customers, of course, to create, to sort of inspire adventure, provide means by which that can happen. But that is also very committed to caring for the people here who are participating in that. So you described it's not just a company focused on the what, I guess, the car and what that's going to mean for customers, but it's a company that's also quite caring about the how and the experience that your 1,500, 1,600, 2,500, whatever that number happens to be on a given day. How they experience the Rivian way, I guess.
Yeah, the organization is actually the most important product we have. We could create a great first product, but if there's not an organization that's robust and built upon solid foundation sitting behind it, the second, the third, the fourth product, so to speak, won't be there. So that we're very cognizant of that, and that's something Jim is a huge advocate for, and has really helped us think about that as well, is the organization as a product.
And being very intentional, right, about the way we develop the organization, just like you're very intentional about developing the ultimate product that goes to your customer.
So one thing we were thinking about, so there are people who are going to listen to this conversation, going to listen to this podcast, and we were thinking in preparation for today about in what way will this conversation be relatable, or will folks who don't work at Rivian, how will they connect to a conversation with you and a conversation about this company? Because there aren't really many other companies like this out in the world. Their experience is going to be very different. Your experience at Ford was very different. My experience at Starbucks is very different. These were companies that were, Matt used a term earlier, these are companies that are primarily kind of brownfields that exist, have been around for a long time, and so there's often, especially for the kind of lean person in the company, or just any kind of a change agent, any kind of a leader, there's the challenge of trying to influence a brownfield, right? Influence an existing culture to maybe be different. And so oftentimes those individuals, I have been one in various situations, sort of lament that challenge. If it wasn't for this brownfield, if it wasn't for this existing culture, if it wasn't for these, the years that this company has, I could lead the company to operate more effectively, to perform at a higher level, to practice lean thinking, whatever they may be trying to do. Whereas in this situation, there maybe is a brownfield in Normal, Illinois, to some extent, but in really everywhere else, and probably also in Normal, there's really a clean sheet is the phrase, I guess, that I've heard quite a lot today, or greenfield is sort of a concept that folks are familiar with. Anyway, folks often long for an opportunity where there's a green field, where there's a clean sheet, where they can just sort of do it right the first time, as if that would be a different and maybe less challenging experience than they're having in their brownfield. But talking with you guys even just over the last hour and in advance of this conversation, that clean sheet, that green field, seems to have all sorts of challenges to it that maybe somebody who's not in the situation that you've been in with starting up a company, or that you've been in joining a company that's just 10 years old, are actually encountering?
Yeah.
I'm curious, when you thought about sort of building a company from employee number one to the numbers you have today, and as you think about going forward, what are some things that, I don't know, maybe you thought would be easier than they've turned out to be in building a company, or even some things that you thought would be really, really difficult that have turned out maybe to be easier than expected?
Well, clean sheet's challenging because on one hand you get to build everything from scratch, but on the other hand you have to build everything from scratch. So so a lot of times you're not starting from a process, but it's also you have to be careful that as much as we started with a clean sheet, we're also now have a painting that's underway, and it's a constantly evolving painting, and every company has some version of that. So after day one with Rivian, by day two we were already evolving what we'd done on day one.
Stuff on the sheet. Yeah.
So today we're in that state of making adjustments, making changes, as we described over the course of the conversation, that are not too indifferent from what you might see at a larger company that may have 100 years of paint on the canvas, so to speak. And I think it's really important to find the opportunities to improve things, as opposed to find the barriers, and focusing on what those opportunities are. We have lots of barriers or lots of challenges for us, no doubt. Clean sheets seem always, starting fresh always seems, so grass is green on the other side. It always seems like it may be easier, but first, it's, as I said, it's not entirely a clean sheet, and two, it does require a lot of work. It's a lot of building. So a case in point, as you think about take manufacturing processes, we're designing a lot of those processes from scratch, but we're building those off of the aggregate set of experiences we have within the team. Mm-hmm. But because we're designing them from scratch, the challenges we're running. We're going as fast as we can. So in some cases, we wish we had a process that we could at least tweak. In some cases, we'll put a rudimentary process in and remove the clean sheet, knowing that we're going to change that rudimentary process relatively quickly. So to more concisely answer your question, I think one of the most important ways to look at clean sheet, brownfield, regardless how you look at it, is to find opportunities for improvement and be optimistic about hunting for those and going after them.
Yeah, we talked about this a little bit earlier. I was one of those who said, if only I had a clean sheet. My advice is careful what you wish for, because it comes with its own set of unique challenges, right? So not necessarily harder, just different. And RJ talked about, building the plane while you're flying. I talk a lot about laying the track just in front of the train, and some days I feel like I'm one cross tie ahead, and other days I feel like I'm one cross tie behind. And so it's different challenges, but it's incredibly exciting for me, and I think that opportunity inspires a lot of the people who are here. So when I talk to people who are joining us or thinking of joining us from other OEMs, sort of companies that have been around a lot longer, I spend some time talking about the challenges are different here. It's not the same as fill in the blank wherever you came from, and it's for some people that's really exciting. For other people, it's it's super scary.
Yeah, often when I meet with folks that are thinking about joining the company, I always very clear on this, and I say, part of being a Rivian, this is, if you like hiking, there's hiking where there isn't a trail or where the trail is very loosely defined, and then there's hiking where there's a paved trail. Both are forms of exercise, but this, without a paved trail, it's a very different experience. And for some people, they prefer that, and we're always we've gotten much better about it, but we're very precise about how we explain that to people before they come in, to say, look, this is a steep.
This is going to be different.
This is a steep and difficult, but highly fulfilling climb.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So the question that Jim gave us to ask you
oh boy.
Before you walked in, so why in the world did you want to start a car company?
So I've been a car person since I was a kid. So grew up in and around cars since I was, a little kid, just loved cars. then got involved in restoring classic cars, and it's been sort of one of my central, like, defining passions is the automobile.
There's a lot of car companies out there you could have gone to work for.
Yeah. So as I started to get older and understand the sort of system around cars and around automobiles, it started to deeply bother me that the things that I loved so much were simultaneously responsible for really damaging the place in which we lived, as a human being, our only home, so to speak. And I'm simultaneously really into the outdoors, so it was just this weird and painful crossroads where two of the things that I loved most were
in conflict.
Were in perfect conflict. So decided to really study that and go into that, and by the time I was maybe 20 years old, I knew I wanted to start this company, and then it was just a question of when and how. And if you asked me, when I was 20 years old, how I do it, I would have said I'll probably go work somewhere for some time. But ultimately, the circumstances evolved such that I started the company much sooner, and certainly glad that I did. But it was really at the nexus of how do we create vehicles that are simultaneously exciting and will inspire people in the same way that cars inspired me as a kid, but then also enable and promote the outdoors. And you hopefully can see that in our brand. That's very much what we're going after.
Yeah. Well, Jim, who did step away, says he asked you that sort of essentially that same question when he first met you back at MIT. Why in the world would you want to start a car company?
Yeah.
And so he's been curious as to whether your answer today is the same answer that he received back then or not.
Back then, yeah, it's probably even sharper. So I met Jim Womack when I was at MIT long time ago, and he was giving a course that I was sitting in on, and near the end of the semester, I went up to him and said, "Hey, I'm thinking about starting a car company. You guys know Jim Womack." So
yes.
That then began a 20-minute set of questions, which were both highly interesting, highly humorous, and highly challenging.
Yes, of course.
But ultimately, it was really that desire to create something that could simultaneously satisfy both ends of the spectrum. Drive towards sustainability, but also enable enthusiasm for the automobile.
Cool.
Well, since Jim's not here, I'll let you know he thinks you're nuts.
Thanks again to RJ Scaringe and Jim Morgan for joining Josh and I on the podcast. To learn more about Rivian, check out rivian.com. Thanks to Emma Ripp and Lori Moniz, producers of WLEI, and thanks to you for listening. RJ was a keynote speaker at the 2018 Designing the Future Summit. To learn more from leaders like RJ, check out LEI's 2020 Designing the Future Summit at lean.org/designfuture2020.